When you hear the word immortal, what comes to mind? For many, it's the idea of living forever, like the character in the movie Inception who never ages. But there's a more scientific definition of immortality. In biology, an immortal cell is one that can replicate indefinitely. And we have one set of cells to thank for this discovery. In 1951, a poor black woman named Henrietta Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment of her aggressive cervical cancer. Doctors took a tissue sample from her tumor without telling her, expecting it to die within a few days, like all the other cells they tried to grow in lab dishes. But unlike those cells, Henrietta's cancer cells didn't die. They multiplied endlessly, doubling every 20 to 24 hours. And so began the creepy tale of HeLa cells, the first immortal human cell line that would go on to be used in countless experiments, including the first ever human cell culture and the first genetically engineered human cells. But here's the thing. Henrietta never consented to any of this. When she died 2 years later from cancer, part of her body lived on in labs around the world without her or her family's knowledge. It was in tea until 1973 that a researcher at a pharmaceutical company noticed that something was off with the cells they'd been using for an experiment. They traced the HeLa cells back to their source and informed the hospital, which then contacted the Lacks family. By that time, Henrietta had been dead for 22 years. You might be wondering if scientists could just take anyone's cells and grow them in a lab. The answer is no. Most normal cells can't live forever. They have a limited number of divisions left in them, after which they die or become senescent and stop dividing. Cancer cells, however, don't have this limitation. They keep dividing even when they shouldn't, which makes them potentially immortal. But growing these cells outside the body is tricky because they require a carefully balanced environment and are easily destroyed by the immune system. That's why it took so long to grow HeLa cells in a lab. What's also interesting is how immortal cells age. As HeLa cells divide, their chromosomes become scrambled and damaged, which eventually kills them, so they're not technically immortal. They just seem that way because they can double so quickly. To study them, scientists had to find ways to keep them alive longer, which they eventually did using techniques like cell fusion, which creates hybrid cells that are more stable than HeLa cells on their own. All this raises some haunting questions. What would Henrietta have thought if she'd known her cells were being kept alive in labs? Would she have seen it as her cells, or something more like a biological abomination? It's hard to say. But her story raises important ethical questions about consent, legacy, and the meaning of life and death. And it makes us wonder, is the secret to immortality hiding in plain sight? This is our channel. Can cancer cells really live forever? Turns out we have an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks to thank for that discovery. Or maybe we don't. In 1951, Henrietta was a 31-year-old mother of 5 who was desperately poor. She had an aggressive form of cervical cancer and went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment. There, a doctor took samples from her tumor without telling her, without asking for her consent, which at the time was standard practice for African-American patients. What he found was astonishing. Unlike normal human cells, which have a limited lifespan and can only replicate a certain number of times before dying, Henrietta's cells just kept multiplying. They were immortal. And it wasn't until years later that scientists realized why. You see, cancer cells have a gene called telomerase, which allows them to keep their DNA from deteriorating, and that makes them potentially immortal. But this isn't usually a problem for scientists because cancer cells are, well, they're not very nice. They're notoriously difficult to work with. They grow to slowly, stop dividing after a few generations, and generally just die off. But HeLa, as these immortal cells would come to be known, could survive being transported around the country. They grew rapidly and could be cloned endlessly. They became the first immortal human cells ever grown in a lab. And so began the incredible story of HeLa. Within a few years, these cells were being used to study everything from the effects of radiation to the development of new viruses to, yes, the search for a polio vaccine. When Jonas Salk developed the first polio vaccine, he used HeLa cells to grow and test the virus. Without Henrietta's cells, the testing would have been impossible and the vaccine might never have been created. But here's the thing, Henrietta died in 1951, just 5 years after her cells were taken. She never knew what had happened to her, or how her cells would change the world. And her family had no idea any of this had occurred until decades later, when one of Henrietta's sons saw a news article about HeLa. By that point, the cells had spread to labs all over the world, and there was no way to stop them now. It's a fascinating story, but it also raises some important questions about ethics in science and medicine, questions that are just as relevant today as they were 70 years ago. Like, should scientists have told Henrietta what they were doing with her cells? Should they have asked for her permission? And is it ever okay to take someone's cells without their knowledge? It turns out that the answer to that last one is yes. It's okay. It's actually been done to hundreds of thousands of people. Most of the time it's been done to people of color. But that doesn't make it right. Thanks for watching. Are cancer cells immortal? If you ask me, these cells are our greatest invention and also our most dangerous enemy. Let me explain. They're called HeLa cells, and they're derived from a woman named Henrietta Lacks. In 1951, at the age of 31, Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Doctors at Johns Hopkins removed a sample of her tumor and sent it to a lab where a scientist named George Gay began to grow her cancer cells. He had no idea that he was about to create the first immortal cell line. That means cells that could replicate endlessly, which is exactly what HeLa cells can do. They double every 22-24 hours. Because of this discovery, Henrietta Lacks' name is buried in a graveyard in Baltimore. No one told her family what was happening until the 1970s, when they read about HeLa in the newspaper. By that time, her cells had already been used in more than 11,000 experiments. They were being sent into space on a mission to see if they could survive the journey. Pharmaceutical companies were testing new drugs on them, and scientists were using them to map genes. The Lacks family was shocked to learn that these cells were still alive decades after their mother's death. And they were furious because they weren't told any of this. What made it worse was that the companies making millions of dollars from HeLa were doing it without telling the family or getting their permission. To make matters even more complicated, the Lacks family was poor and living in a segregated part of town. Most of them had only a high school education, so they struggled to understand what was happening. But they knew they didn't like being lied to. At the same time, scientists were beginning to realize that HeLa cells were a bit of a problem. They were contaminating other cell cultures, meaning that some of the experiments being done with HeLa cells were actually being done with something else. This was, of course, a huge problem, because it meant that some published research was wrong. And so, scientists began to hunt down every experiment that had used HeLa cells to try and verify their results. It was an enormous task because by that point, HeLa cells were being used in about 85% of all cell culture labs around the world. What's more, scientists realized that HeLa cells had been passed off as other cell lines, which meant that researchers who thought they were studying something very specific might have actually been studying something else entirely. Today, we still use HeLa cells for all kinds of things, including growing new tissues and organs in the lab. But because of the problems they cause, scientists have developed other cell lines that they prefer to use instead. As for Henrietta Lacks, her family eventually filed a lawsuit against the company that had taken her cells. But by then, the statute of limitations had expired, meaning they couldn't do anything about it. This story isn't just about science. It's also about ethics, consent, and exploitation. It's about a woman who was never told what was happening to her body, a woman whose cells were taken without her permission, and a woman whose family has spent decades trying to get answers. What if I told you there's an immortal cancer cell line that has been the key to some of the most important medical breakthroughs of the last 60 years? You might be thinking of HeLa cells, a line of cells taken from a woman named Henrietta Lacks without her knowledge or consent in 1951. 51 years later, they are still being used to grow cancer in a dish, test the safety of new drugs, and even produce viral vaccines for things like polio and COVID. That makes HeLa cells one of the most important tools in the fight against cancer and other diseases. But the story of how they became that important is a dark one that has forced the scientific community to confront some very uncomfortable truths about consent, exploitation, and the cost of progress. Henrietta Lacks became a symbol of the countless sacrifices made by patients like her, who had no say in how their bodies were used, whose stories were often lost to the pursuit of knowledge, and whose contributions went unacknowledged for decades. It wasn't until 1976 that a reporter uncovered the truth about HeLa cells and published it in a magazine. Suddenly, scientists were faced with the uncomfortable reality that the cells they'd been using for years had come from a woman who'd never even heard of them. let alone agreed to be part of this research, was a revelation that shook the scientific community to its core. The use of HeLa cells raised fundamental questions about ethics and consent that had never been properly addressed before. How could scientists take something that didn't belong to them and use it for their own gain? What was the true cost of progress? And who had the right to make decisions about the use of human tissue? In the years since then, major changes have been made to bioethics and patient rights, ensuring that everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. But the story of HeLa and her cells continues to remind us of the importance of those changes. It's a story that reminds us that behind every scientific breakthrough, there's a human story. And in death, Henrietta achieved a form of immortality, not just cellular, but historical. Her story is now forever entangled with the moral spine of modern science. HeLa's sacrifice was not in vain. Her cells continue to save lives and improve the world for millions of people every single day. If you liked this video, stay tuned for more stories about incredible women who changed the world. Thanks for watching.